Hello. Happy Thursday evening. I'm really excited to come to you to talk about dystonia treatment and the sensory and motor components of that, because you all shared that that's what you wanted to hear about. So thank you for that. I've been getting some great questions about dystonia treatment. We've been sharing cases and different treatment ideas, and I'm hearing from you, and I'm excited to tell you about it. So if we haven't met, my name is Julie. I am a neurologic physical therapist, and I am the owner and founder of a neurologic rehabilitation practice in the Los Angeles area. We have 2 locations, and we work together as a team: PT, OT, psychology, yoga therapy, fitness and exercise professionals, to work with all kinds of neurologic disorders. But we love dystonia. We love working with people with dystonia, and as well as many other things. But particularly I love dystonia. And I shared a case earlier this week of a woman that I've been working with, and a couple other folks at our practice have worked with as well, who has cervical dystonia. And what I wanted to share is a little bit about how we have gone about her treatment progression. And we're going to hit on the sensory and motor components. And even how we've worked with her, the medical professionals, for her benefit as well. And I think this will answer a lot of your questions. But if you have questions, put them in the chat here. I'm going to refer to some articles with background pieces, and I will put these into our newsletter this week. So if you are a clinician, you can join that newsletter at reactiveeducation.com. If you're a person with neurologic disorder or a family member, you can join at reactivept.com. So first, let me talk to you about this person who graciously said, yes, we can share her story, because she was pretty excited. She really has a fully regained control of her movement. And she is pretty excited about that. So she said, yes, share my story. So she developed cervical dystonia. And like most people with dystonia, there didn't seem to be a really clear onset. She had injured her shoulder during CrossFit, and then developed some tightness in her neck. And it became so much that she had a prolonged tilt and a rotation of her neck. That's very common in cervical dystonia. Sternocleidomastoid is very commonly impaired or involved in cervical dystonia. So head tilt to the same side as the muscle, and rotation. You can see my sternocleidomastoid there. So she had this very common presentation of dystonia. She could not move her head to the middle, so she was rather stuck in this position. She could just slightly move it, so she couldn't turn her head to look. She had difficulty driving. She has kids at home. She really couldn't care for them and cook and clean and do all of the things at home. So driving was out, cooking and cleaning was out. She had difficulty sleeping. She had a lot of pain. She ended up having her parents move in to help with the house and everything. And she really struggled to participate in all of her activities of life. So we met her about a year after onset, and one of the first things that I recommended was a movement disorder neurologist. So she was seen by an orthopedic physical therapist colleague of mine, and he said, I don't know what this is, but I bet you do. And he was right. So very thankful for him referring her to us. It was definitely cervical dystonia. We sent her to a movement disorder neurologist to begin the process of the medical management. That includes a lot of testing for genetic factors and things like that. But most importantly, and especially with cervical dystonia, folks with idiopathic cervical dystonia can regain control, some of the control, through Botox injections that are very targeted to specific muscles. And this is where PT comes in, where we can actually take that person through all kinds of their daily activities and use surface EMG on the muscles and help determine which muscles might most benefit from injection. So we did just that with this person. We communicated with their movement disorder neurologist. We actually helped them get into even another movement disorder neurologist who was more of an expert in cervical dystonia. She got great results with the Botox to where she had a little more control, but still not full control. And so she came for physical therapy. And we really pinpointed that there was a sensory and motor component to her problem. Now, somebody had asked me, but I want to know why sensory motor training? So I've got to give you a little of the literature here when it comes to what's the underlying potential pathophysiology in dystonia and cervical dystonia. And what we know in the literature, and again, I'll share these resources in our newsletter this week. We know there's an overall sensory disinhibition in dystonia, meaning that there's a little more excitation centrally in the central nervous system. We also know that there can be impaired proprioception. So I'm doing this because the neck, there might be impaired proprioception in the neck or in the other joints affected by dystonia. There can also be impaired postural control or postural responses. These are the reflexes organized in our spinal cord and in our brain that provide a cue to where we are in space and upright. So all of those pieces can be impaired in dystonia. And there's this really lovely article, I'm pulling it up over here, and we talk about this. I kind of dove back into some of these pieces again because they're in our dystonia mini course. And if you're a clinician, this is on sale for this week right now. So we have a mini course where we have 2 hours going through all of these pieces for clinicians. And we talk about this idea of neuroplasticity gone awry in dystonia. And particularly there was this one article that really changed my focus and how I thought about dystonia. And it had something called the SMILE model, which is sensory motor loops in the brain, and actually shows through some of the research in dystonia that these sensory motor loops get out of whack, for lack of a better word, get dysregulated. So in this person that we saw, that I shared her video yesterday, after she had her Botox, which typically we see the response not right away, but within 2 to 3 weeks, we start working together and we can see through testing, and I shared this in her video as well, we test the sensory map of her neck. So we can use, in the picture, if you look at the video, there's like a grid, there's a picture of her neck and there's a grid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And we actually ask her to identify different parts of that. That's a sensory discrimination test. And we could see that was very difficult for her. She did not have an accurate sensory picture of her neck, which you can imagine if you don't have an accurate sensory picture of your neck, your brain can't tell where your neck is in space, and it may send inaccurate motor signals. And now everything's contracting, or your sternocleidomastoid is contracting all of the time. So we discovered the sensory map of her neck was impaired. This is very common in dystonia. And then we can train it. So you can actually do that same grid that we use for testing sensation. We can practice with different textures and different objects for the person to localize. Now, this, of course, requires another person, right? And sometimes folks don't have another person at home that can do this kind of tracking and testing repeatedly because it takes a lot of practice. So we use a lot of other things. So I love using the laser headlamp. You can put it on. You can use targets on the wall. You can use targets on the ceiling. You can use targets on the floor. Hands and knees posture tends to be a really great posture for folks with cervical dystonia. And that's where we started with this young woman. Hands and knees, head laser lamp, pointed to a target on the floor, and she started to regain full control of her motion in that position to start. Now, we know she couldn't just crawl around all day, right? So that was just the beginning. We were then able to progress to other positions for her, and that was part of our sensory training. Another part of the sensory training was actually working on those postural writing responses, or these reflexes that we have built into our system, that when we tilt one way or another, our head and our trunk respond automatically to keep us upright. And so we could again test that and see that that was challenging for her, and then we could bring it into treatment. So we used a lot of uneven surfaces. We moved and rocked side to side to try to elicit some of the automatic writing responses. So if a person with cervical dystonia has their head stuck in a right tilt and left rotation, we might actually work on postural writing responses to the right to elicit a left head tilt. So that's making use of our neurophysiology to drive some of that automatic movement. So again, part of the big piece is we don't just try all of these things, we test it out. Is the postural writing response impaired? It's not impaired in everybody, but if it is impaired, we're going to incorporate that into treatment. We tested the sensory map, like I mentioned. It was impaired, so we incorporated that into treatment. We tested joint position error with the laser headlamp. It was impaired, so we incorporate that into treatment. All of those pieces are pieces of the sensory system. And those are all ways that we incorporated it into training. And we started in postures where she had more control. So quadruped, prone, supine, and then moved into postures that were more challenging. So reclined, sitting, standing, and then the ultimate is in moving. And this is very typical in the folks that I see with cervical dystonia. It's in walking and moving that it can be even worse. And so that was kind of the last frontier, was walking, even running, exercising in that position. So that is all part of the motor control training that we did with this person. So again, she had a cervical dystonia that was a right head tilt and left rotation. Very strong sternocleidomastoid overactivation. So that's part of the over excitement or lack of inhibition coming from the brain to that muscle, but also several other muscles alongside of her neck. And so those were the target of the Botox. And then what we really wanted to work on was the motor control of all of those muscles working together in a functional way. So how did we do that? We could use things like an external focus. So for example, we would use a hat, and sometimes it was weighted as well. So we had a weighted hat or headband, and use that as the target for her moving. So moving the brim of the hat. Sometimes we use the laser headlight on the hat or the laser headlamp itself. We have a laser headlamp that projects across, so a horizontal line and a vertical line. And so that's really great feedback for cervical or trunk dystonia because it tells you where you are. And so we used that and a target for her to do an externally focused movement, which brought out more automatic movement for her. And she had more control through her full range of motion. So that's one example of motor control training that we did. And again, we did that through various postures. So the idea of kind of graded motor imagery or graded exposure, we moved from where it was least challenging. So those were positions with the head down. So quadruped, we even did just sitting in a chair, head down and hands down to the floor, and then progressed through more upright positions as she regained control. And that is a hallmark of motor control training in cervical dystonia, but in many dystonias is starting in position where you have control and then moving your way up, not in one session. Like we're talking over a long period of time. And when a person has cervical dystonia and it's very responsive to Botox, this means also we might be kind of going like this. It's a little bit of a roller coaster in that treatment because the person will have a cycle of Botox, which is about 3 months. It might start to wear off. That person might need more strategies as it's wearing off. And then we go again when kind of the peak Botox effect goes into place, and we build up. And what we have found now, for one, she's regained full control of her head. She's no longer tilting and twisted, and she can move her head fully both sides and tilt both sides. She has some slight tightness. That's what we're working on now. She has a slight shift in her neck, which we actually think is due to weakness from the Botox. But she is extending the length between, or the time between her Botox, and that is awesome because that means she's going to regain some strength of her muscles and start to be able to need less and less of the Botox, which is great. So she's fully back, driving, back to life. Her parents moved out. They don't have to help her anymore. She's going to parties and weddings and events and traveling all over the world. It's awesome to see. It really is. And that's why I wanted to share her case with you. Now I'm going to go to your questions. And again, if you, I'll tell you again, I'll put the resources that I shared, the studies, into the newsletter this week. If you're a clinician, reactiveeducation.com. If you're a patient or a family, a friend, partner, reactivept.com. And if you are a clinician, I go into much more detail in our dystonia mini course. It's on sale this week for clinicians. It's only $159. It's a 2-hour course with everything you need to know about dystonia assessment and treatment. And then I have a whole library of resources for you there, including how-tos on all of these things that I talked about today, how to do these assessments and how to do these treatments. It is fantastic. I hope you grab that this week. But I want to go to your questions here. So I get spasticity and functional dystonia in my wrist on and off. Wrist and fingers curl in a fist-like position. Any tips or tricks? It causes a lot of pain. And I'm glad you shared that. Thank you for sharing part of your journey with us too. It can be really painful to have dystonia, whether that's idiopathic dystonia or functional dystonia, because you're getting this twisted and sometimes sustained posture in your joints. Now, I don't know your case specifically, so again, I can't give specific medical advice to you. I haven't assessed it, but I will give some general things for all people and for clinicians to try, and then you can send this to your therapist to assess and treat. And I tell therapists this all of the time because they're like, what should I do here? And I was like, first you need to assess. So for any of these things, we have to assess what is the underlying issue before diving into treatment. But what we know about dystonia, whether it is idiopathic dystonia, like the case of cervical dystonia that I shared with you, or if it's a functional dystonia or a functional spasticity, the sensory and motor components that I talked about are usually part of the picture. So you would want to assess it. We would want to see, what is your brain map of your hand and wrist? Is it clearly defined, or do you not have a great picture of where your joints are in space? So what I would say is your therapist should test that. Test joint position error, test kinesthesia, test stereognosis, test graphesthesia. I realize I'm throwing out lots of big words, but if you share this with your therapist, they will know what I'm talking about. These are higher order sensory tests. to do with the wrist and the hand, I would test those to see if there's an underlying sensory cause that is leading to the dystonia, because that's then where you would treat it. The other thing I would say from a motor control standpoint is I might look to see if we could elicit some automatic movement through external focus, meaning not just saying, hey, can you open your hand, but actually using some sort of target or game to elicit hand opening. And this can be very challenging in a fixed dystonia. So sometimes we see a fixed dystonia, especially with pain. By the way, we're going to talk about this tomorrow with Brittany Kim, our CRPS expert, because it can come with CRPS. And in a fixed dystonia, you can't just like open your hand at all. There's multiple components contributing to that. But I would look at the sensory and motor piece first. Great question. This person also said, thanks for confirming that we're actually on the right track. Awesome. You're on the right track and keep going. And, somebody else shared with me today that they just really felt out of hope for dystonia. And I hear this from people with dystonia. I hear it from clinicians too. Maybe they've tried multiple things and just haven't seen progress. And you know what? That happens to all of us. Not everybody. I shared this video this week of this woman that just really did fantastic and had a great recovery of dystonia. Not every case looks like that. Sometimes we can't figure it all out. Sometimes there's other components that are not under the person's control or abilities or ours. So I want to say, just keep going. And that even in, I have had, even for this woman, I want to say she lives very far from our clinic. And so she was coming once a week to once a month, not very frequently. It took us a long time to figure it out. And there were many components that had to come into place. So I talked about the sensory and motor, but I didn't talk about the lifestyle stuff. This woman took on doing yoga 4 days a week. And I think that was transformative for her. There's so many yoga poses, by the way, that are so helpful for dystonia. And she started exercising every day. She worked with a psychologist. So while I told you just like 2 pieces of the pie, there were so many other pieces. So if you are a physical therapist and you're going like, I'm just not getting at it, there might be other pieces where you could use some help. You could use yoga therapy. You could use occupational therapy. You could use psychology to help you get a little more holistic view of a person's case. That's where I go when I'm really stuck. And honestly, that is why Re+active is an integrated team, because I was pretty consistently stuck just being a PT on my own. Yes, I'm so glad. Thank you so much for the answer. I now know what to bring up to my OT and PT. You are so welcome. That is exactly why I do this. So you can share it with your clinicians, or if you're a clinician, you can kind of know what the next step is. Somebody else asked, do you have a good point to start with adaptive yoga? Oh, such a good question. And, this is where I rely on our folks of our team. Like, we have an adapted yoga class. It's a restorative yoga class for people with neurologic disorders. That could be a great place to start. It's online. You could do it with us online. But you know what? I love working with yoga instructors, and I love working with yoga therapists who do a lot more of the one-on-one and have a really extensive background like clinicians in the anatomy and physiology components of things, and are really good at adapting things to people personally. And so I would look for a yoga instructor or yoga practice that understands neurologic disorders, to be honest. So I'm a little biased because that's what we do at Re+active, but I know there's other places out there as well that do a similar thing and have adapted yoga for people with neurologic disorders. And if this is something, by the way, that you're interested in, you can go to our website at reactivept.com and you can see our group exercise, fitness, wellness services. You can look at our classes. You can look at our instructors. We have our amazing OT teaches our online yoga class, and it's so good because she's so good. So that's what I would recommend for getting started. I have also loved what I did with this patient was we tried a bunch of yoga positions and postures and breathing techniques in therapy because I also have a yoga background. I'm not an instructor. I'm not an expert by any means, but I know and practice enough that we could try out things in therapy. And then I made suggestions to her that she took to her yoga teacher. And then her yoga teacher just did a lot of repetition with her, which I could never do. So that, like, what a great synergy there. I love collaborating with other providers, no matter what the background, getting feedback from them, learning from them, and me bringing what we learn in therapy to their practice. So I would recommend that too. Great question. So I will remind you all, especially clinicians, if you want to keep learning about dystonia, we have our dystonia mini course on sale right now through November 8th. It's an awesome deal. It's $159. It's 2 hours on demand. Do it at your own pace. And you get a whole resource library. How-to videos, how-to sheets for all of the testing and treatment to really make your life easier with dystonia. Way more than I could ever do in these live videos. But I hope I've given you a piece of the why, and even some ideas of how we might do sensory motor training. And honestly, you can really help people improve their lives, regain control of their symptoms with dystonia. So thank you so much for being here, for being curious with me, for loving the brain and all this neuroscience stuff. And join me tomorrow at noon. I'm going to chat with Brittany Kim, our CRPS program director here at Re+active. We're going to talk about CRPS and dystonia. That's going to be a good one. Join me tomorrow at noon. Keep sending me your questions. I love them. And I will see you then. Thanks so much.